So let me introduce Dr. Smadi and today's speaker. And the talk for today's talk is Asset Management, a new approach to decision making. Dr. Smadi has over 20 years of experience in the area of infrastructure and asset management, ranging from payments, bridges, safety, payment marking, signs, and other infrastructure assets. Dr. Smadi is an associate professor with the Department of Civil, Construction, and Environmental Engineering at Iowa State University. He is also the director of the IMO's State for Rural Information Management Operation System program. And he is currently serving as a principal and investigator for several research projects for the Iowa Department of Transportation, the Iowa Highway Research Board, and the federally funded Midwest Transportation Consortium, NCTSPM, SHOP 2, and FHWA. And he is a member of the TRB Committee on Payment Monitoring and Evaluation, and Payment Management and Assets Management Committee. And Dr. Smadi's developed and taught the FHWA Data Integration Workshop and the NHI Assets Management class. He managed an annual data collection contract for payment distress and video log for over 40,000 miles for the state Iowa and the cities and counties in the state. He was in charge of developing, implementing, and populating the SHOP 2 roadway information database, READ, which contained raw data from multiple sources and cover over 200,000 miles. So with that, please join me in welcome Dr. Smadi's talk.
Thank you, James. Good morning, everybody. Now I know why I'm busy all the time. I have too many activities. So it's a pleasure being here. It's my first time. Georgia Tech, beautiful campus, nice facilities. And from the people, at least, that I met with, also nice people. It's really a pleasure being here. James and I and Andrew go a long ways in terms of knowing each other, but we've never kind of connected this way. We submitted a proposal to NCHRP, was it last year, James? Or maybe early this year, I can't remember anymore. But we won a proposal together, so I'll be working with James and his colleagues and staff on this NCTSPM project, and hopefully, collaborate on future activities between Iowa State and Georgia Tech. So, just as background, it is Iowa, not Ohio, and not Idaho, and it is corn and not potatoes. So, just to give you, I'm joking, you guys know where Iowa is. There are some people who mistake it for Idaho. But just to give you a little bit of background on the state of Iowa, it's a rural state, it's a large state, and it's an agricultural state. So there are a lot of corn and soybean. I think we're top in the nation in terms of producing corn and soybean. And well, lately, in the last 5 to 10 years, Iowa is the #1 producing state in eggs. So we produce a lot of eggs. And actually, there is an issue now in the state because of the avian flu. Like USDA says we should destroy about 5.1 million chicken because of the risk of the disease. And the state of Iowa saying, no, it's not 5.1 million, it's 3.8 million. So it's a large number. So your prices for eggs probably are going to go up in the next few months. Because Iowa, again, is the #1 producer of eggs in the nation. So here's where I work. I just actually joined the faculty in civil engineering just last August. I've been a researcher full-time since 1994. The Institute for Transportation is kind of similar to your probably center here where we're doing the seminar. We have multiple centers under the Institute. National Concrete Pavement Technology Center, the Nanotechnology Center, the Earthwork Engineering Center for Weather Impacts on Mobility, C3, which is the largest group. Under C3, there are multiple groups. Then the regional UTC, or what we call MTC. And then we have multiple programs that deal with specific issues construction, asphalt material, technology transfer, and so on. As part of the C3 group, we do a lot of stuff related to safety, asset management, operations, weather planning, sustainability, transportation, economics, and so on. I wear a lot of different hats. Even when I'm in Ames, Iowa, I am an associate professor, so I'm teaching classes. I'm also the associate director for Intrans. I'm the associate director for the regional UTC, and I'm the director of the REMOS program. So there are a lot of, again, things that we get involved in that have to deal with all aspects of the transportation sector. But today we're going to be talking about asset management. And there's a huge emphasis on asset management these days because of the new authorization, MAP 21, which is moving ahead for progress in the 21st century, which was passed in 2012, already expired in 2014, but the law that relates to asset management and performance measures is not implemented yet. And Federal Highway is working on notice of proposed rulemaking. They released 2 in the asset management plan, and there's still 5 more to go in terms of what they're trying to do. So shifting back to asset management, the demand on our highway systems are increasing. You guys, this is, if you don't recognize this, this is Atlanta. That's a lot of traffic. And so, but the resources or funding is actually not keeping up with the demand. So we have a lot of needs, but we don't have a lot of resources. So how do we deal with that as an organization? And that's kind of the premise behind why asset management is important. There's more talk about accountability. The whole reason behind passing the performance measures as part of MAP 21 was to increase accountability. How many of you remember the stimulus funding that happened a few years ago? I think it was about $700, $800 billion that went into infrastructure. U.S. Department of Transportation was able to account almost for every penny spent, how much each state DOT spent and all of that stuff. But there was no linkage between spending that money and what's the outcome of spending that money in terms of improved performance. So, and that's kind of was the impetus behind MAP 21 and the performance measures is we need to be more accountable for what we're trying to accomplish as an organization. There is funding competition. State DOTs in some states at least have dedicated sources of funding from road use tax, but some go to the general fund. And we're competing against what? Education, which you guys are interested in. What else are we competing against? Healthcare, police enforcement, things like that. So when we go to the legislature and say we want to spend more money on our highways and bridges, we're competing against other important activities. So for a society, we're trying to improve the living of the population in certain areas, and we have to be aware of those competitions. As I showed you, the needs are increasing. We had a dip when we had a recession in terms of the number of vehicle miles traveled. That dip is no longer there. We kind of recovered and we're back to full swing. So still, we have a lot of need. We have a lot of demand on the system, and we have to make complex trade-off decisions as an organization. I'll share with you the national performance measures later on, but there are 7 of them. Where do I spend the money? And how do I make that decision? Do I spend it on pavements? Or do I spend it on bridges? Do I spend it on operations? Do I spend it on safety? So how do I make those complex decisions and still try to achieve a certain level of performance to meet my targets as an organization? And if all these 5 are not important, it's a lot. You have to have an asset management and you have to have performance measures. So you really need to be doing this. So let's talk about what is transportation asset management. This is the definition that comes from MAP 21. So this came from Congress. It's asset management means it's strategic and systematic. What does strategic mean to you guys? What is strategic? If I'm strategic, what am I doing differently? Come on, I'm not just going to stand here.
Well planned.
Well planned.
Careful, not arbitrary.
Okay, careful, not arbitrary. I have a process. Am I looking short term or long term when I'm strategic? Long term. Am I reacting or am I being proactive? Proactive. So all of that is in strategic, and that's what asset management is. It's systematic, well thought out in terms of a process. And what are we trying to do? We're trying to operate, maintain, and improve the physical assets. But we're not just going to do it with engineering. We're going to do it with engineering and economic analysis. You're all engineers, I'm assuming, in the room, right? You know, engineers, and I'm one of them, we want to do things 100% right. You know, if we're going to go fix a road, we're going to fix it like it's brand new. And that thinking no longer works. We have to use a mix of fixes. We have to compromise. We have to start looking at what level of service we want to provide as an agency. What is sustainable? I told you Iowa is a rural state. We have about 3.3 million people, but there are 114,000 miles of roads. There isn't enough taxes generated to take care of 114,000 miles of roads. So is that system sustainable? I know Ajay talks a lot about sustainability. We can't sustain that system. So we have to be strategic in terms of, okay, where do we invest? Where do we divest? You know, at some point as an agency, if you can't take care of the system that you have, you gotta pull resources out. And how do you pull those resources out? You know, it becomes an access issue. It becomes a quality of life issue, and you have to address that as an organization. And that cannot be addressed by just the engineering side. You gotta have multiple factors that are considered. But these decisions are based on quality information. And that's where, you know, James and his team talking about how we collect the data, the quality of that data, and how we make decisions with that data is very important. To use that quality information to identify a structured sequence of maintenance, preservation, repair, rehabilitation, and replacement actions. So even Congress realizes that we have to consider all these different options when we're looking at fixing our infrastructure. But we're going to do it in a way that will achieve and sustain a desired state of good repair over the life cycle of the asset at a minimum practicable cost. It's a mouthful. What is state of good repair? What is state of good repair? Does that mean every road is in good condition? Does that mean I'm maintaining my system at a reasonable level to provide level of service, that safety and mobility are not concerns? Does it mean I'm spending the least amount of money to keep that condition? It means a lot of things. And asset management has to have an understanding of what are we trying to accomplish as an organization and start to work toward that. So asset management offers really a three-part solution to this issue that we're facing. The first one is to realize that the most important aspect is to take care of what we have. Because we know we don't have enough money to take care of what we have right now, so why would we build new facilities? What do you think citizens in Atlanta would say to that? You know, people who people who are driving here, you think they're happy? Oh, that's the wrong mouse. You know, they probably want to add lanes, right? Well, what does adding lanes mean? It's going to improve capacity, right? So your congestion might go down, correct? But what does that mean to the maintenance people? More pavement, exactly. So it's more pavement to take care of, more pavement marking lines to put down. If you're a state, well actually you get some snow every once in a while, but if you're in a state that plows snow, you need more trucks to plow snow. You need more trucks to clean the road and so on. So adding capacity solves one issue, but also it creates other issues. And what asset management does, it allows you to look at all of these things at the same time and determine the impact of investing in one area versus another. I was talking to Janelle this morning, and she's, you know, how do we look at the performance measures? let's look at maybe 2 or 3 performance measures. You know, pavement, safety, and congestion. You think they're related? Right? They're related. So if I invest in pavement, I will be improving pavement, but I'll also probably improve safety and maybe even improve operations because speed, people can go a little bit faster. And sometimes people going faster will have a negative impact on safety too. So all of these things are connected. And we have 7 national performance measures that we have to look at, other than the other performance measures that DOTs have put in place as part of their strategic plans, or they're directed to do by the governor or by the DOT director. So all these performance measures, we have to have an understanding of how they interact. And all of that is with the existing infrastructure. We got to manage for the long term, and we have to be better stewards for the transportation system. We got to leave the transportation system at least in the same shape we took it. Because the next generation, what's going to happen to the next generation if we leave the transportation system in shambles? We built the interstates in the 50s and 60s. It was fantastic for 20, 30, maybe 40 years. Now we're struggling. And if we don't do something about it, that system is no longer going to be the system it was created. It's not going to do the job it was intended to do. So we got to be better stewards of our transportation system. And part of that is we have to start communicating to the stakeholders the importance of transportation. Who are our stakeholders? You. Who else? The public, the driving public. Who else are the stakeholders? Who makes the funding decisions? The legislature. So the legislature, the public, the businesses. We talk about transportation and economic development, they go hand in hand. And so we got to be talking to them. They have to understand the value of transportation, and the majority of them do. And they get the ear of the legislatures because they're lobbying for their interests. So and asset management becomes this communication tool, a consistent way of actually communicating between the agency and the multiple stakeholders. So we can't be communicating with them by saying, oh, our roughness on the interstate system went up by 2%, or now my IRI is 113 inches and I need it to be 100. They're not going to understand that. We got to communicate to them with terms that they can relate to. So we have to turn it into mobility, we have to turn it into access, we have to turn it into safety, we have to turn it into operations. But at the end of the day, as engineers, we need to know the condition of the system so we can determine the best alternative to fix it. So here's the first part. We have to take care of what we already own. And to be able to do that, asset management is going to help agencies stretch the dollars and reduce the risk. The MAP 21 requirements talks about a risk-based asset management plan. So we have to start looking at risk, and we have to start making decisions based on that. Step 2 is managing for the long term. When we only look at the initial cost, it's only one part of the puzzle. It's really this cost of ongoing maintenance and renewal that hits you hard, and the agency doesn't plan for it. When we do project evaluation, we look at the cost of that project, initial cost, and sometimes we actually look at life cycle costs, and we select the project. Okay, so the initial cost was $2 million, and the life cycle cost for this project is $10 million. And we know when we evaluate projects, we're gonna do maintenance, at year 3, we're gonna do rehab at year 10, and so on. The agency does that when they run their economic analysis. Does the agency go in and set money aside for year 10 and year 15? They don't. So even though we go through this exercise, we really don't follow up in terms of what the outcomes should be and the decisions that we're trying to make. And that's very important. Here's a very interesting slide that I borrowed from Minnesota DOT. I really like it. It's the life cycle cost iceberg. So if you watch the Titanic, it was hit by something underneath. They didn't see it. And it's this massive chunk of ice that is the future capital cost that we have to consider as an organization. So initial is important because that's the budget we're dealing with. But what's the impact of doing that project on the long term? And that's what asset management should be looking at is these things. And finally, becoming better stewards. Those grandparents want to leave a system to their granddaughter that she can use and go to work and have economic activity. So from that, asset management is really a process that starts from the planning stage, carries on to design and construction, maintenance and rehabilitation, but it has to be tied to operations. And eventually we do all of this because we want to have a safe operating environment for our motors. So when we look at operations, if I have a facility that carries 2,000 vehicles a day, and I have another facility that carries 200,000 vehicles a day, do you think I'm going to manage them differently? Yeah. So operations become important. And that's why linking of information from multiple data sets becomes very critical to do asset management. So the principles of asset management are pretty simple and straightforward. It's policy driven. Who decides policy at a DOT? Technical people? Or management? Management. So policy driven. So somebody has to say, here's the vision, here's the policy for the Georgia DOT. And I'm sure you guys have you had a statement that probably said, we're going to provide safe, efficient transportation for our users. Then you develop performance measures. And the performance measures is to basically link your policy to your actions. Consider options, data-driven, and it has to be transparent. So I can communicate it, I have credibility, and I'm accountable for the decisions that we're making. So any one of those, if you get one of those out of whack, then the whole process kind of deteriorates. If I have a policy but it's not linked to performance, then okay, the policy is fine and dandy, but how do I achieve my performance goals if I'm not linking my project decisions to the policy that I have as an organization? There are 5 core questions that agencies have to answer to be able to do asset management. Start with, what's the current state of my assets? What does that entail? What do I need to know?
Inventory.
Where are they?
What are their condition?
What's their condition? So I need an inventory and I need a condition assessment to be able to establish a baseline and kind of, measure against that baseline. Then my next step is, what is my level of service that I would like to provide? So if I have a baseline and I have a level of service, then I can determine a gap. And then if I know the gap, then I can start looking at options of how to address the gap. And those options will have to consider assets that are critical. Again, operations and risk. What assets are critical that I really, the performance level cannot go below a certain level on them? And what are the best operations and maintenance and capital improvement strategies or investment strategies that I have to look at? And what's the best long-term funding strategy? If I have answers to those, then I've solved a lot of my technical issues, at least with asset management. So to be able to do inventory and condition assessment, I need data. So there's a strong relationship between asset management and data. And in real estate, what's the key word in real estate? Location, location, location. In asset management, it's data, data, data. And the old, saying of garbage in, garbage out applies perfectly. Because there are a lot of agencies with data that is poor quality, which means the decisions, if they make decisions based on the data, are going to be of poor quality. So we don't want to be drowning in data. We want to turn that data into information so we can start making decisions. Here's an example of linking bridge data, capacity improvement, pavement condition data, and traffic for the Iowa DOT. They were looking at Interstate 80 corridor. It's about 160 miles from the eastern side of the state to the city of Des Moines, which is the capital of Iowa. Interstate 80 carries about 30 to 40% truck traffic, so it's a huge freight route in the state, and they're looking at expanding that. But you know, if you expand the pavements, some cases you have to worry about the bridges, and you have to worry about the interchanges. So how do we do that in a way that we're integrating our decision making to make better decisions for the state? But it's turning the data that we have into information that decision makers can look at. So you know, here are the bridges by color, which ones need replacing based on the condition of the bridge. And here are how many lanes I need to add by year. So now you look at your capacity, you look at your bridge condition, and you also look at your pavement condition, and try to have projects that make sense, that address multiple issues for the state DOT rather than one. And this is just a zoomed in area. So going back to the data, map 21 is about 1,700 pages. There was definitely a focus on safety. It was mentioned 971 times in map 21. It continued the previous legislation in terms of impact of safety. But then you start looking at performance. Map 21 is really the first legislation that introduced performance to the lingo. Data, 361 times. Condition, 171 times. Performance measures, 41 times. And asset management, 40 times. So there's definitely an emphasis on the data. And that's why when we start looking at asset management and that relationship to data, and looking at the different categories, and here's what I'm saying is, are we ready? Are we ready to incorporate data into our asset management process? From an inventory perspective, from a condition assessment perspective, from a risk perspective, and from a financial perspective in terms of cost and benefits. So when I'm doing inventory, it could be an asset like this. In Brazil, this is a private toll road, or an elevated transit facility, to a nice bridge, to the metro in Dubai, a traffic control center. Here is 407 in Toronto. All of these are assets that, as an agency, I have to be aware of, and I have to maintain. Can you, if you don't know what you own, can you maintain it? I mean, you don't know what it is. You kind of know because you built it, you put it there, but you didn't establish a business process to capture this information when you did it. I tell a lot of the DOTs when I go and teach classes, I say, DOT cannot spend $1 without somebody approving it, right? They can't. So if we approve that spending, shouldn't that generate an action that says, oh, you did something here. Does that impact your data? Does that impact the condition? And then start updating this information on a regular basis rather than saying every 3-4 years I'm going to send van, I'm going to send students, I'm going to send staff to do this inventory for us. You might have to do it the first time, but then updating this information has to become part of the business process. You know, here we're talking about traffic sensors on the road, we're talking about signals, talking about pavement marking, and so on. So there are a lot of assets out there that we have to start looking into. Here are results from a synthesis 439 NCTSPM on what the states are currently doing. And of course, pavements and bridges are 100%. You know, there are requirements, HPMS and National Bridge Inventory. But then you start looking at actually other assets, culverts, signs, pavement markings, and guardrail. And we definitely see a lot of activity in state DOTs starting to invest resources and doing an inventory. And here's carrying that to condition assessment. So even though we're getting, you know, inventory of culverts, we're still not getting the condition of the culvert. So we know where they are, but we don't know what condition they're in. And so on for, you know, pavement markings and so on. So once you go below pavements and bridges, the condition assessment is definitely questionable. But for the major assets, it's in pretty good shape. So my assessment is, you know, we do very well in inventory, we do very well in condition assessment. We're not talking about quality right now. We're just talking about people actually, and agencies are looking at this data and trying to make decisions based on it. So the next one is risk. I love this saying, Lao Tzu, 6th century Chinese poet. He said, those who have knowledge don't predict. Those who predict don't have knowledge. And that's where risk comes in. If I have data, I have good quality data, then my risk in prediction is minimized, is a lot less. If I have data, then my risk of failure might be a lot less. If I have a bridge that I know is structurally deficient and I go and put sensors on it, then I'm mitigating my risk because I'm capturing information. So that's how, that's just one thing of how risk can play a role in terms of asset management, is by deciding which assets I'm going to collect data on, which assets I'm going to manage to minimize my risk as an agency. But risk can be looked at from a strategic point of view, from the organization, programmatic, and project. We do a lot of work for risk and project level. We run all types of analysis at the project level, risk of delay, risk of budget overruns, and so on. But we don't do a lot with programmatic and strategic risk. What do you think would be a strategic risk for the organization? Give me an example.
Financial
Money.
sustenance.
Money. How much money I'm going to get? Does the Georgia DOT control how much money they get? You don't, right? The governor decides at some point in the legislature. So there's always a risk of we're not going to receive enough funding to do what we need to do. How do we deal with that as an organization? Do we run different scenarios? Do we do the trade-off analysis? That's part of dealing with that risk. Staffing. That's a huge strategic risk for the organization. If you have staff turnover, a lot of staff turnover, you got to worry about training them, making them aware of the policies and procedures and so on. So all of these become things that, as an organization, I have to look at and consider the risk as part of my decision-making process. But risk could come from data, the variability, consistency, and accuracy of the data. Risk could come from our decision support tools, our prediction models. We run a prediction model for payments, and we say, oh, we can predict the condition of the payment for 20 years. How much confidence do you have in that? If I'm making decisions for the next 5, 10, 15 years, how much confidence do I have in those decisions that I'm going to achieve this target? Because each agency has to set targets. So that becomes part of the thing that we have to look at. And how do we address that from a research perspective? Okay, I know there's variability in the data. How do I address that? What kind of scenarios do I need to run? What kind of optimization models or operations research that I have to do to address those? Financial, we talked a little bit about. Natural disasters and man-made disasters. If you lived in New York 3 years ago with Irene and Sandy, you faced a lot of natural disasters. 2 hurricanes hit the state in a short period of time. They took bridges out of service for months. And now the New York State DOT, as part of the risk asset management plan, they've identified 60 structures. They said, we cannot have another Irene or Sandy that will close those bridges for an extended period of time. So their plan is to invest in those bridges to make them basically hurricane-proof. So they're elevating structures, they're building safety measures and so on. 60 bridges, that's a huge investment. What is the impact of spending that much money on bridges on the rest of the network? On their pavements, on their safety, on their capacity. But if the risk is too high of basically, they said they lost billions in economic development and economic activity because of this. Can they afford to lose that again? So they're saying no. The risk is too high for us to have such an activity happen that we would lose billions of dollars in economic development and economic activity, that we want to make that investment. So sometimes, even though that investment impacts other assets, but because I understand that impact, I still can make those investments. Okay, let's talk a little bit pavement. I don't know if you can see this very well. How many of you think this is a good pavement? Raise your hand. Okay, pretty good. Bad? How many say this is bad? Okay, kind of, unanimous. Everybody agrees. What about these? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it so-so? It's so-so, right? And that's what gets us. It's the so-so. That's where our variability comes from. That's where our risk comes from. What do you think our system is? Is it all good? What's percentage that we say all good? Probably 10, 20% if we're lucky. Is it all bad? No, probably another 10, hopefully less than 20% that is bad. So it's that stuff in the middle, which is the majority of the system. And that's why we need consistent and objective and accurate data, because if I wait another year or two of this, it might need a full rehab or reconstruction rather than something that is cheaper. So to minimize my risk of dealing with the majority of the system, I have to get more information about that system. And that's why automated data collection technologies and sensors and tools like that would help agencies intervene a lot faster than they would if they didn't have this information. And that's, when we start talking about risk, part of dealing with risk is that having that understanding and then starting to make investment decisions based on that understanding. And this is just a simple way of looking at risk where what's the probability that it's going to happen, and if it does, what's the consequence of that? So if as an agency, I'm not looking at that red box, what fits in that red box, I missed the boat. Because I could be in deep trouble if I have a lot of events that happen at the greatest risk area, where the probability is high and the consequences are high. Those are assets or activities that I really have to keep an eye on and have a plan for. When we surveyed the state DOTs, the risk in terms of using it for physical is good, for safety is good, but then it really drops down. Looking at environmental stuff, looking at operations and capacity, it's pretty low. So my assessment of risk is so-so. There's definitely a lot of work that could be done, and this is something that if you're a graduate student, whether it's master's or PhD, incorporating risk into the decision-making process is something of huge interest. The last one is, our decision-making. And again, this is from the survey. As you can see the sophistication, if you read the statement, here, our agency supports and is planning on further integration of asset management. Our agency will be working to integrate. Our agency is integrating, and then our agency is using. And you can see we only have 33% that said our agency is using. I mean, these are agencies that are trying to get into the process. We need 100% of the agency in that last category. But it's having data to be able to do something as simple as this. If I don't spend money, what happens to my assets? And this is a simple measure of percent of assets in good condition. If I spend 50 million, I kind of maintain status quo. If I spend 250 million, I improve. So to be able to do this, what do I need? Data. Data on what?
Current condition.
Current condition.
Future.
How do I get future condition?
Models.
Okay, I need models to predict. What else do I need? So we need existing condition, future condition by developing prediction models. What else do I need?
Traffic data.
Traffic. Traffic will impact my condition. Okay. What else?
Demand.
Demand, yes. How do I know, how do I maintain status quo by 50 million? What am I doing? Baseline. But I'm doing projects, right? What do I need to know about those projects? How much they cost? How much they improve the system? What's their life expectancy? What else do I need to know? Who gives me these amounts? Financial stuff, planning, interest rates, all of these are inputs that go into a management system to maintain assets. And each one of those inputs, if you look at it, there is a variability and there is a risk associated with it. So, you start saying, okay, what if the interest rate goes from 4 to 6%? What happens? What happens to my dollar? the value of my dollar. What happens to it? Decreases. So I can't do the same projects I intended to do, which means I can't get the same performance that I thought I would get. What if my prediction model is 20% in error? Then, you know, this line is probably going to be down here. And if I'm submitting a target to US DOT, I'm not going to meet it. So there's a lot of risk involved in that side of it too. And MAP 21 said it supports a risk-based asset management and performance-based management. And that's where they created the 7 national performance measures covering infrastructure condition, congestion reduction and system reliability, environmental sustainability, freight movement, economic vitality, reduced project delivery delays, and safety. So the infrastructure condition rule is out, the safety rule is out, the rest of them are expected by August of this year. And also with MAP 21, transportation asset management plan is required, and those are the different components of the plan. You gotta have objectives, because without objectives, we really don't have a policy. So we have to have objectives. We have to know the assets that we own and assess their condition, which is kind of the first question of the 5 core questions of asset management. Do a performance gap, your baseline, your expected level of performance, and what's the difference. Use life cycle cost approach, have a financial plan in terms of your revenue forecast, your revenue sources as a DOT, which is the tricky part because they don't know, they don't have any, I mean they have some idea, but there are no guarantees, so your asset management plan has to address that. And then what's really most important is your investment strategies. What's your strategy to reach your targets? Because the asset management plan, which at a minimum covers pavements and bridges on the national highway system, that those targets have to match the performance measure targets for infrastructure condition. So there's a stipulation in the law that your performance-based targets are linked to your asset management plan. How do I develop an investment strategy to achieve those targets? And not achieve them just in one cycle, but achieve them long term. So asset management allows you to look at long term. And then finally, you have to look at risks and how it plays a role in asset management. So, some people say it's not about the money. No, that's not the case. It boils down to how much money do I have? I mean, we can spend the existing resources that we have the best way possible and still not make improvements to the system because we just don't have enough. So eventually, asset management is going to help you communicate why there is a need and how as an organization you're credible, you're accountable, you're efficient, but still you're going to require resources to make improvement into the system. So you got to pass through the guardians of asset management and go through the doors of funding so you can start looking at alternatives. Can we build more lanes here? We just can't. We need other alternatives. So you start looking at different modes of transportation, different decisions. Am I dealing with safety, with mobility, with preservation, and different physical assets. So you have an entire picture when you go down to do resource allocation. It's not just pavement rehab. It's investment in transit. It's doing bike paths. It's doing pedestrian facilities. It's improving safety. It's ITS. It's variable message signs and so on. So you have to start looking at this, a whole lot of investment strategies to be able to do that. And I know we're short on time because I want to allow some time for questions. So I'll skip through some of these and go towards the end. So eventually it's about communication. We really have to communicate what the needs are. And we have, as we said in the beginning, we have to communicate it in a way that allows the stakeholders to understand what we're communicating. And we have to communicate with the political leadership and the elected officials because they're the ones that give you the money. They're the ones they have to agree that, here's how much money you need and here's how you spend it. We have to communicate to the public because eventually every one of us is paying for it. I was talking to, I don't know who I talked to, but the state of Iowa just passed a gas tax increase. The public wanted it. The legislatures and the politicians didn't because, as you know, their motto is no new taxes. But eventually they approved because 80% of the citizens in the state were in approval because the DOT has done a beautiful job communicating. But how did they do that? They collected data. They collected data on every paved mile in the state, whether it's a state road, city road, or a county road. And they put a story together. They have all the data on the bridges because that's part of the National Bridge Inventory. They put a story together. They said, here's what we have, here's how we're spending it, and here are the needs. And it's not because we want more money. Look at the condition of the infrastructure. So they were able to convince the public, which in turn convinced the legislature to increase the gas taxes. And then we need to communicate to management, technical managers, and field staff, because they're the ones that implement it. And managers, do we have any policy decision, top-level management in the room? Okay, I can say something about this. You can shake your head. I saw your management people. So, some technical people say, oh, they're not interested in data. And I agree, they're not interested in data. They're interested in information. And they're also interested in this information in a quick way. We can't ask a question and then say, oh, by the way, 6 months, I'll be back with an answer. No, it needs to be done quickly. So Utah DOT is very effective in communicating. The DOT director wants a tool that he can take to the legislature, like on his laptop, and say, if I spend 50 million on pavements and 30 million on bridges, here's what happens. If I take 10 million from here, put it there, here's what's going to happen. So he needs a trade-off tool to be able to support his argument with the legislature. So we can't just, it's 3 months, it's 4 months to get an answer. So we have to have these tools. The decision makers are interested in information. Yes, they're not interested in data, but they're interested in information. And the more they know you have information to support their questions, the more questions they will ask.
Okay, so I think it's getting, because I'm not sure the next
class is going to be here.
class is coming or not. So I think I'll open for the question to see that if you have any question. No, I think I have one question here. I know that you introduced this.
There's a question there.
You mentioned monitoring the risk of failure or state of the road or facilities using sensors and stuff. What's the state of the art in that? Is it reliable?
You actually can put sensors on a bridge and be able to predict the performance of that bridge. It's about $250,000 a bridge. So, but again, looking at risk, looking at operations, you have, the bridge that connects Virginia to DC. I forgot the bridge name. It carries about 450,000 vehicles a day. It's 100 some years. That bridge, I'm going to go in and invest in sensor technology to be able to get an accurate representation of the condition of that bridge because I cannot afford to close that bridge. So again, using risk, using operation to know when to invest. Can I do that on 6,000 bridges in the state of Iowa? No, I can't. But can I isolate a certain number of bridges and use technology to help me reduce the risk for those? I definitely can.
So one question I have is related, this is a new approach for assets management. This is also people here as a researcher, PhD student, graduate student. So the question I have, I know that you touched a lot of areas that require changes, etc. If you talk about the research need, and what are the one pop up your mind? Say there's a top 5 out of the one that you're talking about. Area require some of the research need to do some of the study to advance.
Okay. So I'll follow up on that with just immediately talking about risk. Incorporating risk into decision making is a new area for at least civil engineers. and we haven't done much work on that. It's Federal Highway is giving a pass to the DOTs. Right now they're saying, it's going to maybe not this transportation asset management plan, but the next one, you got to have more risk incorporated. So how do I take a risk? We talked about it right now from a bridge or a failure perspective. But how do I take financial risk, investment risk, how do I take risk in data, decision support tools, and incorporate that into how an agency makes decisions, and actually change the way they make decisions based on that. So that's definitely a top research area that, I don't have any guidance on it. I can have examples, but we haven't done research in that area. The other thing is, you saw the 7 national performance measures. Show me one of those that does not relate to the other. They're all dependent and interrelated to each other. So how, at an agency, I can make the determination between, if I spend on one performance measure, what's the impact on the other? So how do I link the decision-making process for these different performance measures? With Janelle and I talked this morning, and she said, is it okay to focus on project delivery? And I said, yes, it is okay, because if I don't deliver my projects, what happens to the rest of my system? Every improvement we make is a project. And if I don't deliver that project or that program, then I basically get a fail in terms of development. So how do these performance measures interact and link to each other? So that's 3. You asked for 5? Decision support tools. So right now we do more of a trade-off of investment. Basically, if I run 5 scenarios for pavements, 20, 30, 40, 50 million. I run 5 scenarios for bridges, 20, 30, 40 million. And I can tell you, if I spend 20 million on pavement and 30 million bridges, this is what happens. But if I take it from bridges, put it to pavements, this is what happens. But I really didn't do a trade-off analysis. All I did is I just did, this shifting of resources. But true optimization of resources is, should I be spending more money on pavements versus bridges? What's the impact? What's the benefit of spending on one asset versus the other? By looking at the cost, and looking at the benefit, and the impact on my performance measure. We have not done that. And then the last thing is, how can I collect good, consistent, reliable data in a timely and cheap way? So new tools to be able to collect data using the technology that we have today compared to the technology we had 5 years ago, and get this information so we can start making decisions.
Okay. Any other question?
I got a quick question. So they say that if you want to get the habit of flossing all your teeth, start by flossing just one. So if you have to get agencies hooked on asset management, what's the one tooth to floss?
Wow, that's a good analogy. I'm going to use that the next presentation I make.
Two.
I don't know if it's 1 or 2, but that linkage between policy and actions is very important. If you don't take care of that, you might be making progress, but you won't know and you won't be able to measure it. So linking policy in terms of what a DOT wants to do to the actions, which is basically what they end up doing in the field, is very important. So if you get that, if you floss that one, you're in good shape. But again, flossing is 2 teeth, right?
So there's a class coming up, so please join me. Thank you. Omar did a very impressive view on this subject here, and thank you very much.